Buckingham Palace has been thrown into turmoil following shocking reports that King Charles has sent Queen Camilla into exile at a secret monastery. This comes during a period of profound change within the royal family. After a scandal that allegedly wrecked one of the most significant royal events of his reign, what was meant to be a proud and historic celebration instead descended into chaos, leaving the king both humiliated and enraged. Sources close to the palace reveal that the fallout was so devastating, Charles was left with no choice but to act swiftly and decisively. But what could Camilla have done to provoke such an extreme response? Today we uncover the startling truth behind this royal exile. The night that shook the crown did not begin with a royal decree or a scandalous headline. It began with smoke. Thick, curling smoke rising from the royal study, carrying with it the scent of burning parchment and pride. Inside the centuries-old room, Queen Camilla stood before the fireplace, her face illuminated in flickering shades of gold and crimson. In her hands was the official plan for the upcoming state banquet honoring German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, an event that had required weeks of careful royal coordination. Before the ink on the approval had even dried, Camilla struck a match. By the time King Charles entered the room, it was too late. The heavy doors swung open just in time for him to see the royal crest curling in the firelight, the papers reduced to ash. His voice was tight, half disbelief, half fury, as he demanded, "Camilla, what have you done?" Her response was cold but deliberate. "I'm rewriting my place, Charles. I won't stand beside you as a silent decoration." It wasn't just defiance. It was a declaration. What followed was chaos veiled in silence. Staff, sworn to secrecy, exchanged uneasy glances as whispers spread through the corridors. The Queen had burned the king's official documents. The king had stripped her of authority. By morning, the palace that once ran with clockwork precision moved like a ghost, cautious, fearful, and unsure which way the crown would turn next. Outside, Windsor Castle was cloaked in mist, as if it too wanted to hide from the turmoil within. They say Charles spent that morning pacing in his private chambers, staring out over the rain-soaked gardens, struggling to craft a statement that could calm the public without exposing the truth. When the royal office finally spoke, the message was short and calculated. Preparations for the banquet would continue under the king's direct supervision. Not a single word mentioned Camilla. In royal terms, silence often says everything. Meanwhile, across the corridor, Camilla sat in solitude, her candle flickering low. Servants whispered that she hadn't slept, only stared into the dancing light. The shadows on her face revealed both defiance and heartbreak. To some, she looked strong. To others, shattered. Both may have been true, for what burned that night wasn't just parchment. It was the fragile peace that held her marriage together. Those close to the palace say her act was driven by years of quiet frustration, of being politely sidelined, of existing as a footnote in the grand story of the monarchy. Even as queen, Camilla was haunted by ghosts, especially the one whose portrait hung in that very room. Diana's serene gaze seemed to watch over the scene, her eyes reflecting the firelight, silently judging. Some say Charles glanced at that portrait as the papers burned, and for one haunting moment, the room stood still. After that night, nothing felt the same. The palace routine resumed, smiles returned, and the German president was welcomed with all the expected royal grace. But behind every polished gesture lay a tension too deep to hide. Camilla attended the event, yet her name was missing from the printed program. She appeared in person, but not in official photographs. The public saw elegance and order. Insiders saw fracture. Rumors spread that Charles had quietly removed her from state matters to ensure no further revisions could take place. Still, whispers told of Camilla gathering a small circle of loyal aides, people who believed her actions weren't madness, but a message. "A crowned woman," she reportedly said, "must choose between dignity and power. I've made my choice." What truly burned that October night wasn't just paper, it was illusion. The monarchy, built on control and composure, had revealed a crack that ceremony could not mend. Charles left the study with trembling hands, clutching the royal seal, realizing that his greatest challenge wasn't foreign diplomacy, it was the conflict inside his own home. And somewhere in that same dim room, where ashes still clung to the hearth, Camilla whispered softly to herself, "I won't let anyone extinguish this fire." Whether that flame meant rebellion or ruin, no one yet knew. But as rain washed over Windsor's stone walls, a single question echoed through every corridor. What drives a queen to set her own crown aflame? Could this storm inside Windsor's walls reveal something deeper than royal unrest? The whispers had grown into a storm, the silent rebellion of Windsor. That week, tension inside Windsor was thick enough to feel. Beneath the scent of fresh carnations and the gleam of polished marble, something darker lingered, a quiet storm no one dared name. It didn't start with anger, at least not openly. It began with a meeting meant to unify the royal family under one purpose, a grand welcome for German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier and his wife. The event marked 27 years since such a meeting between the two nations, a moment King Charles viewed as a milestone of his reign. But what he envisioned as a symbol of unity would soon spark something far more personal. Morning light spilled through the tall windows of the royal reception room, illuminating a table draped in crimson velvet. Stacks of documents lay perfectly aligned, and the staff stood poised, pens ready. Charles spoke with calm authority, his voice echoing across the polished hall. "This isn't just diplomacy," he said. "It's the image of Britain we're presenting to Europe." His gaze swept the room. William, Anne, the Princess of Wales, and finally, Camilla. He began assigning roles. William, with his charm, would lead the ceremonies and the opening toast. Anne, disciplined as ever, would oversee security with the Foreign Office. Kate, elegant and modern, would manage the press and public image. "The spotlight will naturally be on you," Charles added with a faint smile. Then came the pause, a brief, weighted silence before he turned to her. "Camilla," he said evenly, "you'll handle the banquet seating and reception room decorations." It seemed a small task, but to her, it felt like an insult carved in stone, the kind only someone who had fought too hard for her place could understand. Camilla's gloved hands trembled slightly, though her expression remained composed. William avoided her eyes, Anne pretended to adjust her notes, and Kate offered a polite smile. No one spoke, but the chill in the air was unmistakable. To outsiders, the Queen's assignment might have seemed suitable, even graceful. But to Camilla, it was another reminder of her fragile standing. For years, she had endured gossip, ridicule, and endless comparisons to those who came before her. She had borne the public scorn, the whispers, the pity. And now, in that bright Windsor room, her husband had reduced her to arranging flowers and chairs. When the meeting ended, the others left quickly, their footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving behind a silence heavy with things left unsaid. Camilla sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the paper before her. Her name, listed last, even below Kate's, seemed to gleam with a quiet betrayal. The ticking clock filled the silence as she murmured, "Reception room decorations." The words dripped with bitter irony. A queen in name, but not in command. By noon, Windsor buzzed with restless activity. Servants rushed through corridors balancing trays of crystal glassware. Florists argued over rose shades. Secretaries answered phones without pause. Yet behind closed doors, Camilla remained alone. The tea beside her sat untouched. Her reflection in the mirror appeared serene, regal even, but her eyes gave her away. Beneath that polished smile, a slow, quiet anger smoldered. It wasn't just one slight. It was the weight of years spent being underestimated. Her trusted aide, Mrs. Hill, hesitated before breaking the silence. "Your Majesty," she began softly, "shall I confirm the seating arrangements with His Majesty?" Camilla's reply came gently, almost teasing. "No need, Mrs. Hill. Meetings are meetings. Decisions are decisions." Then she paused, her voice sharpening ever so slightly. "But tonight we'll arrange things differently." Those who knew her would later say it wasn't the words themselves that unsettled them. It was her calm, certain tone. The sound of a woman who had finally stopped waiting for approval. Later that night, long after Windsor's corridors had grown quiet, a single light still glowed in Camilla's private office. The distant hum of the staff faded, replaced by the soft rustle of paper, the scrape of chairs, and the whisper of cards being switched, names rearranged in a silent act of defiance. To any outsider, it might have seemed petty, but inside palace walls, such gestures carried power. It was her way of taking back control, however quietly. When dawn came, Windsor stood immaculate, just as Charles had envisioned. Yet behind that perfect order, something imperceptible had shifted. A quiet rift had formed. The Queen had fulfilled her duties, yes, but on her own terms. And as the grand doors opened to welcome the German delegation, Camilla stood beside her husband, poised and composed. Behind her calm smile, however, her thoughts had already moved elsewhere, to something that would soon disturb Windsor's fragile balance forever. Because humiliation, once rooted in a heart like hers, doesn't fade. It grows, patiently, powerfully, waiting for the right moment to bloom. What unseen storm was already forming within those walls? That night, silence at Windsor became the spark of something much greater. The evening at Windsor Castle was meant to be. Uneventful, just another polished page in the royal record of a king preparing for yet another grand banquet. Outside, the lawns shimmered beneath the last glow of the setting sun. Inside, the corridors were hushed, the silence broken only by the soft rhythm of servants readying for the German president's visit. But behind those stately doors, something far less ceremonial was unfolding, an intimate rupture that would leave a deeper scar than any public scandal. King Charles thought everything was under control. The plans finalized, speeches approved, schedules perfected. Yet in a nearby study, Queen Camilla sat alone at her desk, reading the final draft of the banquet program. Her eyes moved over the lines once, then again, until the realization struck with cruel clarity. She wasn't mentioned at all. No title, no role, no speech. In the pages that defined the crown's most prestigious evening, Queen Camilla had been erased. That omission, so small yet so deliberate, sparked something long smoldering inside her. Years of being tolerated but never fully respected. Countless appearances where she smiled while whispers trailed her. All that quiet resentment crystallized into a single act of rebellion. Later, people would call it the 10-minute uprising. Brief, but unforgettable. By the time Windsor's halls darkened and servants retreated for the night, a storm was brewing behind locked doors. When Charles returned to the library after speaking with the Prime Minister, he noticed a flicker of light under the study door. It wasn't candlelight, too bright, too alive. Inside, Camilla stood before the hearth, motionless. Her pale hair glowed in the firelight. In her hand was the state banquet file, the same one he had signed earlier that day, the one that had erased her. Calmly, she uncapped a pen, crossed out, "Approved by His Majesty, King Charles III," and replaced it with deliberate strokes. Her Majesty, Queen Camilla presiding. Without a word, she pressed the royal seal and dropped the document into the fire. The pages curled and blackened, flames devouring them whole. Charles froze, his face shifting between disbelief, anger, and sorrow. "You've just burned your own dignity," he said quietly. Camilla didn't flinch. Her voice was even, her gaze unwavering. "Dignity," she replied, "is for those who are seen. I'm merely reclaiming what was taken from me." The words lingered in the air like smoke, thick, unshakable. The fire between them burned hotter, no longer a symbol of warmth, but of division. Charles reached for the royal seal, but she didn't resist. She simply smiled faintly. "You can put out the fire," she murmured, "but not the memory." Later, the fire would be described as small, contained to the hearth. But what it consumed couldn't be replaced. That night didn't destroy papers. It destroyed trust. The bond that had once held their marriage together dissolved into smoke drifting through Windsor's ancient halls. When Charles finally turned away, Camilla remained still, her face lit by the fading embers. Servants would find her there hours later, unmoving, eyes fixed on the ashes as though staring at her own vanishing reflection. From that night on, the whispers within Windsor changed. They were no longer about titles or gossip, but about the woman who had dared to burn the emblem of her silence. And though the years would pass, the palace never quite healed. For that quiet blaze had consumed more than parchment. It had burned away the illusion of harmony, the last warmth between a king and his queen. Inside Windsor's walls, had the flames ended more than just a fire? What lingered was the echo of something raw and irrevocable, the moment when duty, betrayal, and truth collided in the dark. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick enough to feel. The palace had gone still, yet in the west wing a single light remained. Camilla sat by the window, her robe draped loosely, a forgotten cup of tea cooling beside her. In the glass, her reflection stared back, tired, wounded, humiliated. Charles's words from their argument replayed in her mind like a cruel echo. He hadn't shouted, but every word had cut deep. He had called her reckless, accused her of overstepping, and used that tone, the one that made her feel like an outsider, rather than the woman who had stood beside him through decades of storms. The words hurt, not because they were new, but because they confirmed her deepest fear, that no matter what crown rested on her head, she would never truly belong. By dawn, that pain had hardened into determination. Camilla wouldn't cry or plead. She would take back control quietly and completely. At 3 in the morning, she summoned Mrs. Hill, her loyal aide who had been with her since her Wiltshire days. Hill entered cautiously, already sensing what was coming. Camilla's voice was calm and deliberate as she gave her order. By morning, I don't want to see a single old face in this palace. Not one. And just like that, Windsor began to change. As the first light of October crept across the gardens, staff were dismissed, offices cleared, and long-serving attendants quietly escorted through the side gates. The restructuring, as the palace memo would later call it, was executed with ruthless precision. Vans arrived before breakfast. Familiar faces vanished before anyone could say goodbye, and by noon, new staff, hand-picked by Camilla herself, filled the halls. They were loyal, discreet, and above all hers. The transformation was not only in personnel, but in appearance. Every carpet was replaced with cream and gold tones, which she claimed reflected modern elegance. Royal portraits were rearranged, with Charles's grand image replaced by hers. Even the space that once honored Diana's memory was overtaken by Camilla's own coronation portrait, surrounded by roses. When one aide hesitated, Camilla silenced him with a single phrase. "We can't keep worshipping ghosts." The palace had never seen such swift and calculated change. Some called it decisive, others whispered revenge. When Charles learned what had happened over breakfast, even he was stunned. His spoon clattered against the saucer as he read the report. 6 hours. That was all it had taken. The staff replaced, the portraits changed, Windsor transformed in Camilla's image. Walking through the halls later that morning, Charles noticed unfamiliar faces who bowed to her before they bowed to him. For the first time, he realized their argument had not been a simple quarrel. It had been a warning. What he dismissed as emotion had become action. Camilla hadn't raised her voice or made threats. She had moved with quiet, relentless purpose until the palace itself answered to her. In a single night, Queen Camilla had done what no royal decree could. She reshaped Windsor from within. And while the newspapers outside would never reveal the full story, whispers spread among those who worked behind the palace walls. In low voices, they called it something else, a name that hinted at the truth behind Windsor's chill, the fall of the Queen of Shadows. That autumn, the palace grew colder, not from the weather, but from the tension that lingered in the air. Once filled with ceremony and grace, Windsor now felt like a fortress divided. Every corridor carried the echo of betrayal. Every polished floor seemed to hum with unspoken conflict. The king's health was fading, and with it, the fragile balance of the monarchy. His doctor had warned him to avoid stress, but how could he, when the crown itself had become his heaviest burden? Inside his private chamber, King Charles sat alone, his cough breaking the silence between the clock's steady chimes. Papers were scattered across his desk, some unsigned, others marked urgent. The ink trembled beneath his hand as he picked up the phone. "You must return, William," he said, his voice rough and weary. "Your stepmother is turning the family into a stage play, and the kingdom is watching." By nightfall, a black car rolled through Windsor's gates. There were no photographers, no fanfare, just the soft hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. Prince William stepped out, pulling his coat tight against the wind. The guards bowed as he passed, their eyes lowered, as if even the air held its breath. He set a file on the table, the altered state banquet plan Charles had refused to approve. His tone was measured, slicing through the tension. "I'm here to end this, Your Majesty," he said. "The palace is no longer your stage." Camilla tilted her head, a hint of amusement in her voice. "You dare?" she whispered. "I don't threaten," he replied calmly. "The press already knows, and Father will no longer protect you." For a moment, the room was silent. The candlelight flickered, casting fractured shadows across their faces, one bound to the past, the other to an uncertain future. William turned to leave, his voice cutting through the stillness one last time. "If you wish to keep your dignity, disappear before it's taken from you." The door closed behind him with a sound that echoed through the corridors like the end of a reign. Camilla sat frozen, her fingers gripping the chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The queen who had once ruled every corner of the palace now sat alone, surrounded by emptiness. Outside, the clock struck 12, each echoing chime sounding like a warning from fate itself. In another wing of the palace, Charles stood by the rain-streaked window, staring out into the darkness. On the desk before him lay a document bearing his trembling signature. Suspend all of Queen Camilla's privileges in state affairs. It was a decision that shattered him, yet he knew it had to be done. Meanwhile, in the grand hall, Camilla's eyes lingered on the fireplace. The flames had long since died, leaving behind only faint, fading embers. The scent of roses still hung in the air, but weakened with every passing moment. Around her, the ancient walls of Windsor seemed to close in, the silence pressing heavier than any crown she had ever worn. For the first time, she understood that the empire she had tried to command was never truly hers. As rain whispered against the windows, the woman who once dreamed of reshaping royal history was slowly being erased by it. Was this the moment everything changed behind the palace walls? Let's explore how one headline quietly dismantled the power once held by Queen Camilla. The story of her silent exile began with calm but chilling words that swept through the press like a quiet storm, cold, deliberate, and filled with hidden meaning. "Queen Camilla temporarily withdraws from all public duties," read the morning papers. The palace described it as a brief medical leave, a short rest under her doctor's orders. But within the shadowed corridors of Windsor, everyone knew the truth. It wasn't rest. It was removal. Behind those polished statements lay a truth no one dared to speak aloud. The Queen had been exiled. At dawn, in the king's private study, Charles signed the decree himself. Rain tapped softly on the glass as he lifted his pen, hesitated for a moment, and then pressed his signature into the paper. His expression was unreadable, but those who stood nearby could sense the finality in the air. Without speaking, he nodded to his secretary, and the document was sealed. By that afternoon, a quiet convoy departed from Windsor Castle. No royal flags, no photographers. Only the dull hum of engines heading north. Inside one of the cars, Camilla sat motionless, her face bare of makeup for the first time in years. She didn't ask where they were taking her. She already knew. The countryside rolled by like a fading film, fields, road signs, and the last glimpses of a life that once felt untouchable. With each passing mile, she drifted farther from the world of crowns, cameras, and courtrooms, and closer to an ancient abbey hidden in the cold Yorkshire hills. When the car stopped, a small group of nuns stood waiting, black-clad, silent, their eyes kind yet cautious. They bowed slightly and guided her inside, to a narrow stone room with a single bed, a chair, and a small window. No mirrors, no gold, no silk curtains. It was a place where even time seemed to hold its breath. "This is a peaceful house," one of the nuns whispered softly. "Here, you can let go." But letting go was something Camilla had never learned. She sat on the edge of the bed, gazing through the misted glass toward a distant bell tower. Somewhere beyond the hills, the lights of the palace still glowed. Charles's lights, William's lights, Catherine's lights. Theirs now, not hers. The woman who had once stood beside a king had vanished into the gray folds of the English countryside, replaced by whispers and silence. Back in London, the story had already been written. The Times praised Charles's composure, calling him a symbol of restraint during turbulent times. The Guardian described his decision as necessary for the crown's stability. Camilla's name, once a daily headline, faded almost overnight. There was no outrage, no sympathy, just quiet disappearance. Days turned to weeks. At the Abbey, Camilla rarely spoke, ate little, and spent long hours wandering the rain-soaked gardens alone. One afternoon, a young nun found her standing before a statue of the Virgin Mary, her eyes fixed, her lips barely moving. "Do you pray, madam?" the nun asked gently. Camilla's voice came hoarse and distant. "No," she whispered. "I just count what I've lost." Her exile became a ghost story murmured in palace. Corridors. The queen who vanished after the Windsor scandal of 2025. She wasn't replaced by another crown, but by silence. And perhaps that was the cruelest punishment of all. No dismissal, no public disgrace, just quiet erasure. In the end, it wasn't anger or rebellion that destroyed Camilla. It was something far more subtle, an invisible undoing. The headlines moved on. The palace restored its image. And across the Yorkshire hills, the abbey bells tolled faintly in the wind. Behind those stone walls, the once queen sat by her window, listening. Every sound, the rain, the wind, the distant chime, reminded her of everything the world had already forgotten. So, what do you believe truly drove King Charles to send Queen Camilla away after that disastrous royal event? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.